Hello grade 11 students, welcome back to our English class. In this video, we are going to start with the second chapter from Snapshots, The Address by Marga Minko. So let's get into the lesson. A brief introduction about the author. Marga Minko, born on 31st March 1920, is a Dutch journalist and writer. She belongs to an Orthodox Jewish family. Minko began works as a trainee journalist. In the early part of the Second World War, Minko lived in Breda, Amersfoort, and Amsterdam. She contracted a mild form of tuberculosis and ended up being treated in hospitals in Utrecht and Amersfoort. In the autumn of 1942, she returned to Amsterdam, and her parents there were forced by the German occupiers to move into the city's Jewish quarter. Later in the war, Minko's parents, her brother, and her sister were all deported, but having escaped arrest herself, she spent the rest of the war in hiding and was the family's only survivor. So that is something about this author, Marga Minko. The story, The Address, is set against the background of the Second World War. The narrator here was the daughter of Mrs. S. They were Jews living in Germany, and they were in perpetual danger of being imprisoned and persecuted. So most Jews were leaving their homes and were going away to safer places. This story is a touching account of a girl who goes in search of her mother's belonging after the Second World War in Holland. But even after finding what she so much wanted to touch, to see, to feel and remember, she leaves everything behind, as those possessions, as those belongings, it could not bring her dead mother back. She decides to move on and live with only memories of the happy times before the war. The address that held so much importance till she visited the place lost its value, and the girl realized that it could get her nothing but pain. Here are the characters in the story. The daughter, she is the narrator who returns to Holland to go to the address where her mother's precious belongings were kept. Mrs. S., so she is the narrator's mother. She was a simple woman who could not see the manipulating and fraudulent nature of Mrs. Dorling, her acquaintance. Mrs. Dorling, she has been described as an old acquaintance of Mrs. S., so she possessed a cunning personality. Alright, so those are the characters in the story. We will now look into the story. The story begins with the narrator who was given a cold reception when she went to her native place in Holland after the war in search of her mother's belongings. After ringing the bell of a house number 46 in Marconi Street, a woman opened the door. She asked the owner if she knew her. The narrator told her that she was Mrs. S.'s daughter, but the owner of the house, Mrs. Dorling, denied the knowing of her. Mrs. Dorling's face gave absolutely no sign of recognition, and she kept staring at her without speaking any word. The narrator thought that perhaps she was mistaken and had rung the wrong bell. Then the narrator got a glimpse of her mother's knitted cardigan, which Mrs. Dorling was wearing. This confirmed to her that she had reached the right address. But Mrs. Dorling excused herself by saying that she could not talk to the girl that day and she should come again later. The narrator wanted to talk to her for some time, but Mrs. Dorling cautiously closed the door. The narrator stood for some time on the steps even after the door was closed. Someone was watching her from the bay window. The girl presumed that Someone other than Mrs. Dorling must be watching her and must have asked why the narrator came there. After this refusal, the narrator walked back to the station thinking about her mother. The memories of the narrator's bygone days come to light. Her mother had provided the address years ago during the war. Her mother had given her Mrs. Dorling's address in the first half of the war. When she went home for a few days, she could find that various things were missing. Now, at that time, her mother told her about Mrs. Dorling. She happened to be an old acquaintance of the narrator's mother. Lately, she had renewed contact with her and had been coming there regularly. Every time she left their house, she took something home with her. She told that she wanted to save all their nice things. The reason Mrs. Dorling gave for her action was that she wanted to save all the good possessions, the good things for them, and the narrator's mother had accepted the idea. She was rather obliged towards Mrs. Dorling that she was carrying such heavy luggage every time she visited, as it was really risky during the war. The narrator arrived at the station without having paid much attention to the things on the way. She was walking in familiar places again for the first time since the war. She didn't want to upset herself with the sight of streets and houses full of memories from the previous time before the war. In the train, she remembered the first time when she had seen Mrs. Dorling. It was the morning after the day her mother had told her about Mrs. Dorling, who was wearing a brown coat and a shapeless hat. The narrator had asked from her mother if she lived far away, as she was carrying a heavy case. Her mother told her that Mrs. Dorling lived at number 46 Marconi Street. The narrator had remembered the address, but waited a long time to go there. Initially, after the war was over, she was not interested in all their belongings lying with Mrs. Dorling. She was afraid to see their belongings lying in Mrs. Dorling's house in boxes and cupboards, and needing to put back in their old places again. She was scared that the things might make her very nostalgic, but gradually her life became normal again after the war, and one day she became curious to know about all the possessions. As the narrator's first visit yielded no result, so she planned to go once again. She decided to visit a second time. Interestingly, this time, a girl of about 15 opened the door as her mother was not at home. The narrator asked about Mrs. Dorling. She was told that Mrs. Dorling was not at home, so she followed the girl along the passage. The girl made her sit in the living room and went inside. The narrator noticed an old-fashioned iron candle holder which they never used. There in the living room, the narrator was horrified to find herself in a room she knew and did not know. She found herself in the midst of familiar things which she longed to see again, but which troubled her in a strange atmosphere and in a very tasteless manner. She was hurt to see her family's belongings lying in a tasteless way, with the ugly furniture and muggy smell. The tablecloth, the silver cutlery, and even the still life showing the apple on the tin plate belonged to the family, but everything was lying in a tasteless manner. The narrator was keenly observing the girl who had brought back, similar to that of Mrs. Dorling. The girl was placing teacups for tea from a white teapot, so she took out some spoons from the box. All this crockery and cutlery belonged to the narrator's family, but perhaps the girl was not aware of this fact. The girl cracked a joke about eating dinner in those antique plates. The narrator also found a burn mark on the tablecloth. The narrator indirectly hinted to the girl that they missed things which are either missing from their original place or have been loaned to somebody. The narrator remembers the time before the war when her mother was alive and the narrator was either bored or ill. Her mother would ask her to polish the silver cutlery. So she was surprised to hear that they were using silver cutlery for everyday eating. The narrator decided that she could not stay there anymore. The address was correct, but the narrator didn't want to remember it anymore. She felt that the objects were linked to a memory of a time which no longer existed. They had lost their value in the strange surroundings. So she comforted herself by thinking that her present house was too small to accommodate all the old stuff. So she left the house, leaving all her family's belongings behind. Through the story, the narrator brings to light the miseries and the loss, mental as well as physical, brought by war. Every war brings a lot of upheaval. The normal life is disturbed. The narrator wants to forget the address because the memories of her mother are associated with it. She gets sentimental and does not care for the possessions. They are useless as their true owner was no more in the world. Alright students, so that is the end of this chapter. I hope you have learned something. So I'll be seeing you in the next video. Until then, take care and stay safe.